Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Litsa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
My grandmother's name was Eleanor. My mom was pregnant with me when my grandmother died of breast cancer at the age of 60. When I was born a month later, I was named Eleanor after her. Although I never had a chance to meet my grandmother, I am told that she was gracious and kind. My mother spoke about her often and told me that she thought of her every day. My mother's name was Evelyn. I was pregnant with my first child when she died of pancreatic cancer at the age of 57. It only follows that when I gave birth to a baby girl months later, I named her Evelyn, after my mother. My mother was compassionate, warm, and nurturing. My daughter never had the chance to meet her, but I talk about her all the time. I think of my mother every day, cry about her once in a while, and dream of her less than I would like. When I started working with grieving families many years ago, I wasn't sure how the recent death of my mother would shape my ability to help others facing similar circumstances. As is typical with loss, the death of my mother had a profound effect on me, in good ways and bad. I soon discovered that losing her had given me the perspective and strength I needed to help others walking through a darkness that had become quite familiar to me. And thankfully, whatever help I gave to others, I have gotten back in kind. For it is only because of the wisdom that other grievers have given me that I've been able to find peace and acceptance for my own losses.
My name is Litsa Elizabeth Williams. Litsa from my grandmother, my mother's mother. This is the name for the crazy Greek in me, the loud, passionate, emotional me. The me who hugs people I just met and believes that food is love. The me who was taught that weddings, baptisms, and funerals should include every person you've ever met, and that 15 minutes late is on time. Elizabeth for my grandmother, my father's mother. This is the name for the rest of me. The me who was taught that some emotions should be quiet and all problems should be private. Who was taught that there are clear lines between acquaintances, friends, and family, and that weddings, baptisms, and funerals are small, intimate events. The me who knows that you should always arrive 5 minutes early. Williams from my father, who died before my 19th birthday, before I had declared a major in college, bought my first car, first house, or settled into a career. This is the name for the me that was raised on sarcasm, math problems, and college basketball. The me who knows that Mick Jagger was right. You can't always get what you want. I've taken a winding road from Britain and a master's degree in philosophy to Baltimore and a master's in social work, to working with homeless adults, troubled kids, and grieving families. It's those individuals who have taught me more than I ever could have hoped to learn in my 20 years of schooling. Though I never imagined I would find myself here, I'm confident it's where I'm supposed to be.
This week, we're thinking about continuing bonds, which is a grief theory that we talk about all the time here on the podcast, as well as on What's Your Grief. Even though you may never have heard of continuing bonds theory, we think that it probably has played a role in your life, because the way we continue bonds with our loved ones and the way our loved ones continue bonds with their loved ones provides the string that ties past to present, our ancestors to our children and to us. And it is an important concept that brings comfort to a lot of people who are grieving. So what is continuing bonds theory? Litsa, can you fill us in?
Yeah, so though this, I won't say this is a formal definition of continuing bonds theory. To generally describe it, it's a theory that came about in the late 1990s that really changed the way that we think about what grief is and what it means. So continuing bonds is the theory that when your loved one dies, grief isn't about working through this linear process that ends with acceptance or a new life where you've moved on and compartmentalized your loved one's memory in the past. Rather, it's when a loved one dies, the idea that you slowly find ways to adjust and redefine your relationship with that person, allowing for this continued bond that will endure in different ways and to varying degrees throughout your life. So it's really about the idea that we continue our relationship with people who have died.
And one of the reasons why I personally have been thinking about continuing bonds this week is because Mother's Day is coming up on Sunday. And continuing bonds is the reason why I know of my grandmother who died before I was born, because my mother often talked about her. It's how I continue my relationship with my mother. And I think even most importantly to me personally, it's how my children, my two daughters who are old enough to talk about this with, and not yet my baby daughter who will one day, I will one day talk to about this. It is how my daughters know my mother through the way that I continue bonds with my mom and talk about my mom. They're able to get to know her and to learn about her. Litsa, do you have any relatives who you feel like you didn't know well in person, but through continuing bonds, you really got to know?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that I've been thinking about this a lot as well recently for different reasons. My uncle died, unfortunately, a few weeks ago, and my mom's brother. And my mom's father, my grandfather, he died when my mom was a kid. So my mom herself only has, sort of few memories of her dad. But one thing that has been really important to my family's history is my grandmother and grandfather were both immigrants to the United States. They came here from Greece and they opened a restaurant together. And when my grandfather died, he left my grandmother to run the restaurant. And, very much a sort of American dream story where my grandfather, his memory is something that was kept alive for my mom, mostly through some of her memories, but mostly through stories from other relatives. And that's been the same for me and for my sister. And where a lot of those connections have come through the stories about my grandparents and what that process looked like when they immigrated here. So that's certainly one. And, slightly differently, I think the other thing that's interesting is that when I was 4, my mom had a baby between me and my sister. My sister is 6 years younger than me, who was stillborn, and his name was Christopher. And my mom really made a point to make sure when we were growing up that we knew that Christopher had been part of our family in a way that was very different than I think most kids knew to think about what it means to have a sibling. And we would go to the cemetery and we would visit Christopher's grave and we would talk about Christopher. And I think that is something too that my mom had a connection clearly with Christopher that was really important, and that she wanted us to understand, and that she wanted to be kind of part of our relationship and our family. So I think that always stands out to me when I think about ways continuing bonds have impacted me.
Yeah, something that you said really resonates with me. That idea that somebody can still be a part of our family through continuing bonds. I think when someone dies, one of the things that feels the most painful is that there is this physical hole where that person was meant to be or used to be. And so I think, though, that we can never fill that physical space, and we will always want that person's actual physical presence. I think through continuing bonds, we're able to allow them to psychologically be a part of our family and to be present for us and for our loved ones. And so that's one of the things about continuing bonds that just resonates so much with me. And you talked about those stories that people tell, and I think that the storytelling is so important. I of course have the memories that I have of my mother, but what we know about continuing bonds is that as people grow up, as people get older, they start to wonder and want to know their loved one through different lenses and from different perspectives. And so for me, my mother died when I was in my early 20s. And when I got a little bit older, I started to wonder more about her when she was in maybe her 20s. What was she like as a young wife, as a young mother? And so in order for me to get to know her in new ways, I had to talk to my dad or reach out to her twin and ask her questions about her experiences. And it was through their stories that I was able to get to know my mom in that adult way that I always wished I had been able to know my mom. She died just before, right when we were on the cusp of being able to have that adult relationship. And so I think that those stories are so important. And we want to encourage people, especially with Mother's Day and Father's Day around the corner, to share those stories and to have that open dialogue and to talk about these connections.
Yeah, and I think to know that, sometimes when I think we talk about continuing bonds, especially because we give it a name and it's a theory, and, depending on whether this has been part of your family or if it hasn't, I think sometimes people can get the feeling that it has to be these big dramatic things, like we're going to have this big dramatic storytelling sit down and certainly it can be. It may be that for a special day like Mother's Day or someone's birthday or something, that there are these conscious efforts to make connections. But in so many ways, continuing bonds is just little everyday thing. It can be so much just part of the way that we talk about and communicate things. And I think about, for me, people in my life who never knew my dad. My dad died when I was 18. And so there are many people in my life who've been incredibly important to me who never knew him. And I think that a lot of them would say they have a good idea of who my dad was and what he was like and things about his personality, not because I've had big dramatic conversations with them, but because anytime there's something in my world that makes me think about my dad, I often share it with the people who are around me who I love and care about. So maybe that's a partner or a friend. I think, Elle, for you, I've loved getting to see how that plays out with your kids, of you just sharing things about your mom in all of these different ways that then allow your kids to just so comfortably be able to talk about your mom almost as if they knew her directly, even though I know that they didn't.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, that it doesn't have to be some big hurdle to get over. It can be the smallest things. Like, I just remember my mom saying, looking at we were holding hands or something like that, and her just saying, "You have my mom's hands." Just the smallest things, and maybe I'll sing a song to the girls, and I don't sit around and sing songs to the girls. I wish I was Maria von Trapp, but I'll sing them a song before they go to sleep at night, and I might say that's a song my mom used to sing. And so it can be the smallest things, and then we will have those moments where, something will hit me, and it'll be that grief wave, and I'll just stop and I'll say, God, I really miss my mom. I really wish my mom had gotten to meet you. She would have really loved you. And so one of the reasons I think why we are talking about this and thinking about this, like we said, is Mother's Day and Father's Day. But we've also recently gotten quite a few questions from people who are wondering if the types of things we're describing right now are okay to do. So we've heard from a lot of parents who are wondering if it's okay for them to talk about their deceased loved ones to their children. So it might be, an example might be, let's say a mother who's grieving the death of her mother, that the kids maybe didn't know very well or didn't know at all. And she's wondering, is it too much? Is it scary? Is it overwhelming? Is it wrong for me to talk about my mother to my kids? Or it might be the example of parents who maybe had a child who died before subsequent children even knew that child.
Yeah.
And so the question might be, should we keep talking about the child who died? Are we scaring our children? Are we overwhelming our children? Maybe are we making, are we talking about this in a way that makes our children feel uncomfortable? And so I think based on what we just discussed, you can tell where we land on this topic, but we do want to take a few minutes to talk about it, because one thing that we know from some of the research out there is that kids who have a loved one die when they're young want more memories of their loved one. Like, very seldom do we hear a child say, like, no, I'm good, I have enough memories now. Like, my memory bank is full. We always want more memories of people. And so one thing we know is that kids want to have some of these conversations. And there is definitely a way to have these conversations that can bring comfort and benefit to both the adults and to the children involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, kids want connections and and they may at different times, it may be more or less obvious how much that is the case. But I think oftentimes that connection and sense of family is something that brings so much comfort to children. It's what allows us to think about sort of our place in the world in these different ways. And building out a complex understanding of that is really important for kids, and it becomes really important for the adults that kids turn into. So I think, this is something where sometimes when people ask this question or they're concerned, I feel like my response is almost so emphatic that I'm like, I'm sorry, it's not to make you, feel like it was a dumb question for worrying about it or hesitating about it, because it comes, the hesitation, I think, or those concerns about, is this okay? Is this going to screw up my kids if I'm telling them about my grief or my dead loved ones, their siblings who died, or whoever that may be? It comes from a place of concern and the fact that we don't want to screw up our kids. No one gives us a handbook to figure out what's the right way and the wrong way to do this. So I think it comes from all of those worries that just exist for all parents and caregivers and family members of thinking, is there a right or a wrong way? So I think that reassurance that becomes so important is just knowing this done with thought and in a deliberate, conscious way is actually really, really great for kids.
And I think that most people, common sense, know when they're sending a scary message to their child.
Yes.
If your message is, my loved one died and the world is not safe and we're all not safe, that's different, right? That's different than normalizing the fact that people do die and we grieve them and there are sad feelings about that and we still remember them. That's different than sending scary messages. Or if we're talking about maybe children where one child died and there are surviving children, comparison type of messages that make a child feel like they don't measure up, or they feel overshadowed, or they feel forgotten. There is a difference, but I think most people, if they stop and think about it, they're very aware. I think the very people who are asking this question are the ones that we're least worried about actually sending these messages too, because they're thoughtful about it. And I also think, like, we do make mistakes as parents all the time. And that's why it's important to have an open dialogue with your kids and to frame this as though it's something that they can ask you questions about. Like, please ask me questions about my mom if you ever are wondering about it. And to provide them answers that seem honest. Like, you don't need to tell them every last detail often with young ones, but being straightforward and honest lets them know that you're going to tell them the truth when they do have questions. And so I think having an open dialogue can prevent the damage that a lot of people are worried about being done.
Yes, absolutely. And like so many things in grief, just having that open dialogue and conversation.
Yes. And I do actually think that it's an impediment. There are actual legitimate barriers that are placed when you decide not to share about a loved one. And there are quite a few. Well, just even thinking about the dialogue piece, the stunted dialogue and open communication is one of them.
Yeah, I think that feeling where families, and we see this, there's some research that Comfort Zone Camp did with parents and families years ago, where there was bereaved, where there for children who had lost a parent. And one of the things that came out loud and clear in that research was that in families where there wasn't a culture of having open conversations about loved ones who had died, that oftentimes people felt like they were tiptoeing around each other. So parents were tiptoeing around kids, kids were tiptoeing around parents. And these were cases where the child knew the the loved one who died most of the time. But when we think about just what that creates in terms of family communication, whenever we have something we're not being kind of open and communicating about, suddenly there are what they all sometimes call like no speak rules or no talk rules. Suddenly there are these informal, it's not a rule anybody said out loud or made, but where suddenly the culture becomes, oh, that's not something that we ask questions about or that we talk about. You know, we know maybe that mom's mom died, but mom never brings it up, so we don't want to ask her about it. And so all of a sudden, even if you didn't deliberately intend to create a certain culture, by not creating dialogue, we do end up creating a culture or making things that feel off limits.
Absolutely. And I think that don't think that if you don't mention it, it won't occur to a child.
Right.
Children are very naturally very curious about you, about your life, about your loved ones. And they're also pretty perceptive and can pick up on when parents and family members are having a difficult time and struggling with certain emotions and coping in certain ways. So it's not that it's going to go unnoticed if you don't say it. And I think that it's important to remember that your children are learning now how to handle things for the rest of their lives. So what they learn in childhood based on their experiences with you, and there's a concept called modeling, where kids learn by watching people around them, and you as a caregiver are a model for them, where children learn what's modeled for them. And so when we have a stance towards we don't talk about our loved ones, we can't be open, we don't encourage people to experience emotions that are quote unquote bad or scary or distressing, that's what they're going to take with them quite often into adulthood. And so we're going to continue to see patterns of people feeling like they can't connect with their loved ones, like they can't express their emotions and talk about their emotions. And that can be pretty detrimental in the long run for people. And I understand that in the here and now, it just feels like you're trying to cope and do the best you can. So I don't want to make anybody feel like they've screwed up their kids because you know, every day is an opportunity to have a conversation with a child.
And every day, I think, is an opportunity to look at how we were shaped by the modeling and culture of our own families. So it may very well be that if you've had some hesitations about talking openly about people who have died or the emotions that come with grief or all of that with your kids or your family, it may very well be because that's how your family operated. It wasn't sort of something that was part of growing up for you when you were a child, something that you saw modeled. Maybe because your family didn't have any losses like this, where there was an opportunity for modeling at all, or maybe because there was, and we know that this has changed a little bit over the years. Just a couple of generations ago, depending on your family's cultural background and other factors, sometimes things just got swept into the past, and it was just, we all got to focus on moving forward. And so it may be that you haven't seen this type of modeling. And when we grow up in a certain culture in our own families, we tend to replicate that when we then have families of our own. And if we want to do it differently, we sometimes have to make really conscious, deliberate efforts to say, you know what? In my family growing up, we were not great at talking about this sort of stuff. We didn't talk about family members who died, and I wish we had, or we didn't talk about some of the hard feelings, and I wish we had. And now I'm going to make a conscious, deliberate choice to look at how we can do this differently in our house.
Well, that's a really good point. And I think it's important to point out, as you shared with Continuing Bonds, this is a theory that is relatively, in the grand scheme of things, new. And so for most of the 20th century, the models that were put forth implied that we should not stay connected to our loved ones and gave people many times the feeling that they should disconnect from them and that it was pathological to quote unquote hang on or to stay connected. And so it may be that everybody thought they were doing what they quote unquote should be doing. I use a lot of air quotes today. But what we learned through Continuing Bonds, which came about in the 90s, is that it's totally normal to stay connected, and it actually can be very comforting. And so that actually brings us to another important point about if we don't continue bonds, if we don't feel like we can talk openly about our loved ones, we're cutting ourselves off from that source of comfort if we find that comforting. There are relationships in which continuing bonds doesn't feel comforting for a number of reasons. And so if it doesn't feel good for you, that's okay. I encourage you to investigate that a little further and see if maybe that just might be where you are in your grief, or if that comes from a little bit of avoidance, or if it's truly that your relationship was troubled. If your relationship is troubled in life, it's often troubled in death as well in terms of continuing bonds. However, if you are somebody who has that desire to stay connected, if we say to ourselves, we're not going to talk about our loved one, we're not going to open up these lines of communication because we're worried that it's going to upset people, or it's going to make our kids feel uncomfortable, we're cutting ourselves off from that, and we're cutting our kids off from that continued bond with their relatives. And when we talked at the beginning about creating a space in the family, we're not allowing our loved ones to occupy their space in the family by cutting off the continued bond.
No, exactly. And I think that that concept of family and that connection, that sort of intergenerational connection that can become so meaningful and important, disappears. And I know we just talked last week about movies and TV shows and, different things on last week's episode. And one of the movies, I think we probably mentioned, I can't remember for sure, but I think Coco, the movie Coco so well captures this idea that our cultural norm may have been very much impacted by this idea of historically kind of leaving loved ones in the past. But there are many other models for this. And I think, though, that is looking at Mexican traditions, I certainly think because my family was, half of my family was Greek growing up, and there is much more of a connection to the past. There are annual memorials for loved ones who've died and more of a kind of intergenerational connection. I feel really grateful that the way that I was raised allowed for a space for those people who I didn't know to still feel like a part of the family, because they were.
Absolutely. And I think you brought up Pixar movies, which made me think of a different Pixar movie,
Sure.
Onward, which we also just discussed. And in that movie, there was a child who was grieving the death of a father who he never knew. So he's not grieving the memories or the physical connections. He's grieving the loss of never having those things. And I think, especially again with Mother's and Father's Day coming up, thinking about how do we help children who never had a chance to know those really important figures in their lives. And it becomes so challenging if we're not able to talk about our loved ones. And we just want to normalize and encourage you to continue to talk about the people who have died so that they can have those memories. And we're never going to be able to replace that loss, but we can help them find comfort in those memories. And I think this can become challenging, maybe if families are blended after a person dies and there's a new spouse. We might find it challenging to continue to talk about the parent who died, and for a number of other reasons. But regardless, I encourage people to push through whatever barriers exist to help that child get to know their loved one in the way that they might find meaningful in the long run.
And, we talked a little bit about this before we started recording. There's a book that I really love and would recommend called The Disappearance. And it is written by a woman named Genevieve Jorgensen, who had 2 children die in a car accident. And after those 2 children died, they had 2 more children. And in the book, it's written 12 years after the death of her two children, and it's in the form of letters. And one of the things that she describes is that one of her daughters asks her, "When did you first tell me about my sisters who died?" And Genevieve Jurgensen, she's not able to give an answer. She's not able to remember. And the way she describes it in this letter, she says, "We've never hidden anything. And one day they just understood, just like that." And so it was this idea that it was just part of the family from the time that those two older children were born. The two younger children who died were just talked about. And so it wasn't sort of she doesn't describe a big sit down conversation where they did this, but just that it evolved naturally over time, and that the kids were very much able to kind of integrate that and understand it. And so I think it's interesting because it points to the idea that the way that we set a tone is really what can create connections for kids that can evolve really normally and naturally. We're often the ones who have preconceived ideas about how we should or shouldn't grieve, or how we should or shouldn't maintain relationships with people who died. Kids don't have that. And so the way that we introduce that to them really allows and opens possibilities that can, I think, serve them in many great ways going forward.
Yeah, I love that. I think that would be the goal, right? It just being kind of a natural part of everyday life. And I think there are ways that people go about this that don't feel quite as deliberate as people might worry it has to be. Having photos out as reminders. My kids will every once in a while look at a picture that is out of my mom and just be like, "Oh, is that your mom?" Or like, "Where was this taken?" And "Is that John she's holding, or your brother Owen?" And photos, objects, different things that kind of serve as those tangible triggers for having those conversations, reading the same books to your kids that they read to you, again, singing the same lullabies. Those types of things are very natural connections that allow you to feel that connection, and then allow you to pass that connection on down to your kids. And I guess if we leave you with anything, it's just that just anecdotally, I think that it can be such a meaningful, special, and important part of everybody's life. And we just encourage people to give it a try if they haven't already. If you need a reason to, let it be Mother's Day and Father's Day. Let it be, the fact that right now a lot of people are separated from each other. We're in the middle of the beginning of May, and people are socially distanced. And maybe it's the fact that we're all at home together, and maybe we could get out that photo album or have a conversation, watch an old home movie. It doesn't have to be huge, but just get the ball rolling, get the conversation started.
Absolutely. And if the kids are younger, if they're little kids, I think sometimes maybe one of those hesitations is, I don't know if they understand death yet. I don't know if they're old enough to understand death. If I talk about this person who's died, does this open this huge door of having to understand all of these other things? And I think one thing we would encourage you to remember is all of these things are ongoing conversations, right? There's not a day where all of a sudden your child goes from not knowing anything about death to suddenly understanding death, or you sit down and you have a big conversation and it's the death conversation and now they get it, right? That's not how it works. So as things will evolve over time with your children, and as they will slowly over time come to understand more about death and be able to conceptualize more about death, having the framework within there somehow that even when people die, we still are connected to them, that we still talk about them, that they're still part of our life, that in my mind is something that makes death a little less scary. And it makes our understanding of kind of grief and the world a little bit less scary. So I certainly look back for me, and when Christopher died, I was 4, right? I wasn't old enough that I had a really clear picture of death, but I certainly know that part of my understanding of death and grief and the way that we grieve as a family was the idea that even though Christopher had died, he was still there in how we talk about him, remember, and though I don't consciously remember this, I feel like that probably helped as I understood, the way the world and death works, to make it a little bit less scary, to know it's not that somebody simply disappears forever. They're not here in the same way. It might be that we're connected just through talking and memories and sharing, but they didn't just evaporate. And I think that that's something that's important to remember if that's one of the things that's tripping you up about talking with really little kids, is just to remember that too.
And with really little kids, I think it's important to note that really little kids don't understand the most scary aspects of death anyways a lot of the time. And so just introducing it in the most basic terms, I don't think you're going to give them nightmares if you just basically introduce it. And we have a lot of articles on our site about how to talk to kids about death. And so we encourage you to head over there and look at some of those articles, because they can sort of provide some reassurance to people that it's okay to talk about these things. And people die, animals die, losses happen all the time, and they're not going to be immune from that in life. And, if you think about the people who are really there for you in your grief and the people who are really uncomfortable with you in your grief, if you take no other reassurance from this, it's that you're raising kids who are going to be able to tolerate being there in the harder parts of life, and have an acceptance and a normalization of those more difficult parts of life for when they happen to them. You're preparing them for when they happen to them, and you're preparing them to be good friends and family members when they happen to the people they love. So I think starting, to have an open dialogue about the things that happen in life can be really helpful. And there are scary parts of it, but you normalize that and you help support them through that. It's best that they do learn that with you at their time. So with that, I think we'll wrap up for today, but please do head over to whatsyourgrief.com, because there are a lot of different articles on continuing bonds and on supporting kids and talking to kids over there that we think could be pretty helpful to you. And if you have any specific questions about anything that we discussed today, please always feel free to email us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com.